Get him off this yacht. Now. He's killing the entire atmosphere. The words didn't just land. They sliced clean through the warm ocean air like a blade, sharp enough to make conversation stall and champagne glasses pause mid-lift across the upper deck of a 120-foot luxury yacht drifting just off the coast of Miami, where the skyline glowed gold against the evening sky, and every guest on board wore confidence like a second outfit, tailored, polished, expensive. But in that moment, all of it shifted, because standing near the edge of the deck, one hand resting lightly on the brushed steel railing, was a man who didn't match the picture they had already decided this night should be. Darius Cole, 42 years old, dressed in a fitted black shirt, dark jeans, and simple leather shoes. No watch flashing under the deck lights, no designer logos screaming for attention, no entourage clearing space ahead of him. Just presence, quiet, grounded, and completely unbothered. The kind of presence that doesn't ask for attention but ends up holding it anyway. Even before the interruption, even before the voice that now echoed louder than the music itself, the hostess, blonde, poised, mid-30s, wearing a white silk dress that caught the wind just right, stepped forward like she owned not just the event but the tone of the night, her smile thin, her eyes colder than the ocean beneath them. "I'm going to say this once," she added, her voice raised just enough for nearby guests to hear. "You're not on the list. And this isn't the kind of party you just wander into." A few heads turned, then more, like ripples spreading outward, because nothing pulls attention faster than someone being told they don't belong, especially in a place designed to signal exclusivity at every level, from the private dock entry to the invitation-only guest list printed on thick ivory cards. And yet Darius didn't move, didn't rush to explain, didn't even look surprised. He simply turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with a calm that didn't match the tension building around them, and for a second, just a second, it threw her off, because she expected confusion, maybe even apology, but not this, not stillness, not someone who looked like he had already seen this moment play out before it even began. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Darius. The music in the background lowered as if the night itself leaned in to listen, a DJ glancing over his shoulder, unsure whether to keep the vibe going or let the tension take over. Guests shifting slightly, some stepping closer, others pretending not to watch while clearly watching everything. Because moments like this don't stay private. They expand, they pull people in, and the more people who witnessed it, the more charged the air became. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step off the main deck," the hostess continued, now with a sharper edge, signaling to a nearby staff member with a subtle flick of her hand, the kind of gesture that said this wasn't her first time removing someone who didn't fit her version of acceptable. "We have a very specific guest list tonight, and you're not on it." Darius exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, like someone hearing a line they'd heard years ago in a different room, a different city, a different version of this same story. And for a brief moment, his mind flickered backward, not fully, just enough to remind him of a night in Chicago when he was 27, standing outside a private event with a ticket in his hand and being told, "This isn't really your scene." The same tone, the same assumption, the same quiet dismissal dressed up as policy, and now here it was again, just with better lighting and a more expensive backdrop. He looked back at her, eyes steady, voice even. "Are you sure about that?" It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, because something in the way he said it carried weight, not aggression, not challenge, just certainty, and that certainty made a few people nearby exchange glances, subtle at first, then more noticeable, because confidence without explanation has a way of unsettling people who rely on surface judgments. The hostess laughed lightly, but it didn't quite land. "Yes, I'm sure," she said, folding her arms. "We don't make mistakes like that." A man in a navy blazer standing nearby leaned toward his companion and whispered, "This is about to get awkward," while a woman holding a glass of rose raised her phone slightly, not fully recording yet, but ready, just in case, because instinct told her this wasn't going to end quietly. "I'd rather not make this a scene," the hostess added, though her tone suggested she was already halfway. There, so let's just handle this quickly. Darius nodded once, almost politely, then glanced around the deck, taking in the details, the polished teak floor, the soft glow of string lights overhead, the skyline stretching across the horizon, the very event that had been built to feel exclusive, controlled, curated, and yet now felt like it was slipping into something else entirely, something unscripted, something real. You're right, he said finally, his voice calm but clearer now. Let's handle it quickly. The staff member she had signaled stepped closer, not aggressive, just present, waiting for direction, the kind of presence meant to guide someone out without causing disruption. But even he hesitated slightly, because there was something about Darius that didn't match the situation being forced onto him. Sir, the staff member said carefully, if you could just come with me. But before he could finish, Darius raised his hand slightly, not to stop him, just to pause the moment, and that small gesture, that quiet control, made the entire interaction slow down, like a film frame stretched just long enough for everyone to realize this wasn't unfolding the way it normally would. The hostess frowned, impatience creeping in. We don't have time for this, she said, louder now, drawing even more attention. You're not supposed to be here. And that sentence, simple as it was, landed heavier than anything else she had said, because it wasn't about the list anymore. It wasn't about logistics. It was about belonging, about who gets to stand on a deck like this and who gets told to leave it. And Darius heard it. Not just the words, but everything behind them. Years of assumptions packed into a single moment. And still, he didn't raise his voice, didn't step forward, didn't react the way she expected. Instead, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, pulling out his phone, not as a threat, not as a performance, just as the next step in something already decided. And that's when the energy shifted again, more noticeably this time, because people leaned in. Conversations fully stopped now, the DJ cut the music completely, and the only sounds left were the soft movement of the water against the hull and the faint hum of the city in the distance. What are you doing? The hostess asked, her confidence cracking just slightly, because control was starting to slip, and she could feel it. Darius glanced up briefly, meeting her eyes one more time. Fixing your mistake, he said, calm, measured, undeniable, and somewhere behind him, someone whispered, wait, who is that? But no one answered, not yet, because the answer hadn't been spoken, and the silence right before it was about to matter more than anything that came before. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thick and heavy, like the ocean itself had decided to hold its breath, and every person on that deck felt it, even the ones pretending not to look, because something about the way Darius Cole stood there with his phone in hand did not match the story they had already written about him. It did not match the version of events the hostess was trying to control, and that mismatch made people uncomfortable in a way they could not immediately explain. Fixing your mistake, he had said, and now those words lingered, echoing louder than the music ever had. The hostess let out a short laugh, but this time it sounded thinner, less certain, like she was trying to fill a space that was no longer hers to command. There is no mistake, she replied quickly, stepping closer, her heels clicking against the deck with a sharp rhythm that drew even more attention. You are not on the list, and this is a private event. Darius did not respond. Right away, he simply looked at his phone, scrolling once, tapping once, his movements precise, unhurried, and that calm began to ripple outward, because calm in the middle of confrontation has a way of unsettling people who rely on control. A man near the bar leaned in toward his friend and whispered, "Why is he not leaving?" And the friend shook his head slowly. "Because he knows something," he said, though he was not sure what. The hostess crossed her arms tighter now, her posture shifting from confident to defensive without her realizing it. "Sir, I am asking you one last time," she said, her voice rising just enough to reassert authority. "Step off the deck." The staff member beside her shifted his weight slightly, waiting for a signal, but Darius still did not move. Instead, he lifted the phone to his ear, not dramatically, not for effect, just as if he were continuing a conversation that had already begun somewhere else. "Ethan," he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough for the people closest to hear. "I need you to pull up the guest registry for tonight's event." A pause, brief, then, "Yes, the full list." The hostess blinked, caught off guard by the name, by the tone, by the fact that he was not asking permission but giving instruction, and for the first time, uncertainty crept into her expression, small but visible. "Who are you calling?" she demanded, stepping closer, but Darius did not look at her. He listened, nodded once, then continued. "Cross-check the access codes assigned at dock entry and verify against the manifest." Another pause, the faint sound of a voice on the other end too low to make out, but enough to confirm this was not a bluff, not a performance. Something real was happening, and people felt it. You could see it in the way their posture shifted, in the way their attention locked in, because the narrative was starting to tilt, just slightly, but enough. "Sir, this is not how this works," the hostess said, her voice tightening. "You cannot just call someone and pretend you belong here." But even as she said it, it sounded weaker than before, because the room, the deck, the entire environment had begun to move away from her version of control. Darius lowered the phone just slightly, not ending the call, just enough to speak again. "I am not pretending anything," he said, calm, direct, and that sentence landed differently than the rest, because it did not defend, it did not argue, it simply stated, and statements like that carry weight when everything else is noise. A woman near the railing finally raised her phone fully now, recording without hesitation, because she could feel it, the shift, the moment when a story stops being what it was and starts becoming something else entirely. "Ethan," Darius continued into the phone, "who approved the final guest list?" Another pause, longer this time, his eyes lifting slowly, scanning the deck, not searching, not uncertain, just observing. And as he did, a few guests looked away, suddenly aware of themselves in a way they had not been minutes ago, aware of what they had assumed, what they had accepted without question. "That is what I thought," Darius said quietly. Then he lowered the phone completely, ending the call with a single tap, and now the silence was different, not tense, not uncertain, but expectant, like everyone was waiting for something they did not fully understand yet. The hostess took a step back without meaning to, then corrected herself, stepping forward again, trying to reclaim ground she felt slipping away. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, her voice sharper now, almost defensive. "I do not know who you think you are, but this ends now." She gestured again to the staff member, more forcefully this time. "Escort him out." But the staff member hesitated, just for a second, and that second mattered, because hesitation in a moment like this is not random. It is instinct. It is recognition that something is not lining up the way it should. "Go ahead." The hostess pressed, her voice cracking just slightly. "Do your job." The staff member stepped forward, slow, careful. "Sir," he began, but before he could finish, Darius spoke again, not louder, but clearer. "You might want to wait," he said, and there it was again, that calm certainty, that refusal to match the urgency being forced onto him. And it spread. You could feel it, like the tide turning beneath the surface, unseen but undeniable. "Why?" the hostess snapped, frustration now fully visible. And Darius finally looked directly at her, fully, not glancing, not acknowledging, but meeting her gaze in a way that made everything else fall away. "Because in about 60 seconds, he said, his voice even, measured, "you are going to wish you had asked a different question." The words did not shout, they did not threaten, but they landed with weight, heavy enough to shift the entire energy of the deck. Conversations did not resume, music did not return, no one moved, they simply watched, waiting, because something had already begun to unravel, and even before the truth was spoken, even before the name was fully revealed, the power in the room had already started to change. The 60 seconds did not feel like 60 seconds. They stretched, slowed, every tick of time pressing against the deck like pressure building beneath the surface. And people felt it even if they could not explain it. The kind of tension that does not come from noise but from anticipation, from the sense that something is about to break open in a way no one can stop. The hostess tried to hold her posture, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised. But the confidence that once carried her now flickered at the edges, unstable, because control was no longer something she could simply claim. "This is over," she said again. But this time it sounded less like a command and more like a hope, like she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. "You need to leave." Darius did not respond immediately. He let the silence sit, let it expand, because silence used correctly does more than words ever could. It forces people to sit with their own assumptions, their own decisions, their own tone. And as that silence deepened, the crowd shifted again, more noticeably now. People stepped closer without realizing it, drawn in not by drama, but by clarity, by the feeling that whatever happened next would matter. A man near the bar lowered his drink completely, no longer pretending to watch casually. A woman beside him whispered, "Something is off," and he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but not in the way she thinks." The staff member who had been asked to escort Darius out remained where he was, close enough to act, but no longer certain that action was the right move, because hesitation had grown into something stronger, into doubt. And doubt in a moment like this spreads quickly. The hostess noticed it, her eyes flicking toward him, then back to Darius, frustration tightening her voice. "Why are you still standing here?" she demanded. But even as she spoke, the question revealed more than she intended, because it acknowledged what everyone was beginning to see, that Darius was not reacting the way someone in his position was expected to react. He was not apologizing, not explaining, not leaving. And that broke the script she had relied on. "Because you have not figured it out yet," Darius said calmly, and the words landed with precision, not aggressive, not loud, but exact, like placing a final piece into a puzzle that others had not realized they were building. A few guests exchanged looks, subtle but meaningful, because something in that sentence resonated, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact, the kind that does not need validation, the kind that stands on its own. "Figured what out?" The hostess snapped, her patience thinning, her control slipping in small, visible ways now. And that was when it happened, not with a dramatic entrance, not with a loud announcement, but with a shift in attention at the far end of the deck, where a man in a tailored gray suit stepped forward quickly, his posture sharp, his expression focused, someone who clearly belonged to the structure behind the event, not just the surface of it. He moved with purpose, scanning the deck, his eyes landing on Darius. And in that instant, everything changed, because recognition hit before explanation, and recognition carries a different kind of weight, a kind that does not ask permission. The man approached, weaving through the guests who now instinctively made space for him, not because they were told to, but because something in his urgency made them step aside. The hostess turned, irritation flashing across her face. "What is it?" she asked, expecting support, expecting reinforcement, but what she got instead was something she had not prepared for. The man stopped a few feet from Darius, his voice low but clear. "Mr. Cole," he said, and that name, spoken out loud, landed heavier than anything else that had been said all night, because names carry identity, and identity changes context. The hostess blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "Do you know him?" she asked quickly, her voice tightening. But the man did not answer her. He was looking only at Darius now, his tone shifting slightly, not submissive, not overly formal, but respectful in a way that could not be faked. "We were not expecting you to come up to the main deck," he said, and that sentence, simple as it was, unraveled everything, because it implied something no one had considered until that moment, that Darius did not need to be on the list in the way they thought, that his presence was not dependent on invitation but on something else entirely. The hostess felt it before she understood it, the ground beneath her assumptions shifting. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice no longer steady. But the man still did not look at her. He kept his focus on Darius, waiting, as if the next move belonged to him. And Darius let the moment sit, just long enough for the realization to begin forming in the minds of those watching, just long enough for the weight of what was about to be said to settle into the air. Then he spoke, not louder, not sharper, just clear. "I wanted to see how things were running," he said, his voice even, measured, and the simplicity of it made it more powerful, because it did not explain everything, but it explained enough for the man in the gray suit to nod slightly, understanding passing between them without the need for more words, enough for the crowd to shift again, this time not with curiosity, but with recognition, because now the pieces were aligning, now the story was correcting itself, and the hostess felt it all at once, the realization hitting not as a single moment, but as a cascade, every assumption she had made, collapsing into the next. "Wait," she said, her voice catching. "Who exactly are you?" And this time, There was no impatience in her tone, no authority, just uncertainty, real and undeniable, and Darius looked at her fully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. "I am the one who approved this entire event," he said, and the words settled over the deck like a final truth, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. And in that moment, the atmosphere did not explode. It shifted, quietly, completely, like a tide that had already turned long before anyone noticed. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and undeniable, and for a moment no one spoke, not because they did not understand what had just been said, but because they understood it too well, because "I am the one who approved this entire event" was not just a statement, it was a shift in gravity, the kind that pulls everything else into alignment whether people are ready or not. The hostess stood frozen, her posture still upright, but no longer anchored, her confidence unraveling in small, visible fractures, the kind that start in the eyes before they reach the voice. That does not make sense," she said, but the sentence came out slower than intended, like her mind was trying to catch up with reality and falling just short. The man in the gray suit stepped slightly closer to Darius, not in defense, not in urgency, but in confirmation. He authorized the entire guest allocation and funding structure. He said clearly, and this time he did look at the hostess, not with hostility, not even with judgment, just with a quiet certainty that removed any remaining doubt. And that was when the shift became visible to everyone, not just felt, because now the story had a name, a role, a structure, and it no longer matched what they had assumed. A woman near the railing lowered her phone slightly, whispering to the person beside her, "Oh my God," not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to carry. Because realization spreads faster than confusion ever does. The hostess took a step back, just one, but it was enough to change her position in the space, enough to show that control had moved, even if she had not fully accepted it yet. "If that is true," she said, her voice tightening, searching for something to hold on to, "then why are you not on the list?" And the question sounded different now, not accusatory, not dismissive, but uncertain, because it was no longer about removing someone. It was about understanding how she had misread the situation so completely. Darius looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity, the kind that does not rush to explain because it does not need to. "Because I do not need to be," he said, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else that had been said, because it reframed everything. It exposed the assumption beneath her question, the belief that access defined authority, when in reality, authority had been standing in front of her the entire time. A few guests exchanged looks again, but this time there was no confusion in them, only recognition, the kind that comes when a narrative collapses and something more accurate takes its place. The staff member who had been asked to escort Darius out stepped back slightly now, not instructed, not commanded, just instinctively repositioning himself in response to the new reality. Because even without being told, he understood that the situation had changed, that the person he had been asked to remove was not someone to guide out, but someone to defer to. The hostess noticed it, her eyes flicking toward him, then back to Darius. And for the first time since this began, she did not speak immediately, because the space she had been filling with authority was no longer hers to occupy. "You said you wanted to see how things were running," the man in the gray suit added, his tone measured. "This is part of the review, correct?" And Darius gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to confirm. And that confirmation landed differently than the reveal itself, because it introduced something else, something larger than the moment. It suggested that this was not just an isolated incident, not just a misunderstanding, but part of something intentional, something designed to test, to observe, to reveal. And that realization moved through the crowd in a quiet wave, because now they were not just witnesses to an interaction, they were part of an evaluation. Whether they realized it or not, the hostess swallowed, the motion subtle but visible, her composure shifting from authority to awareness. I was following protocol," she said, and the words sounded smaller now, not because they were wrong, but because they no longer carried the weight she expected them to, because protocol without awareness reveals more than it protects. Darius tilted his head slightly, considering her words, not dismissing them, not accepting them, just placing them where they belonged. Protocol is not the problem, he said calmly. Assumptions are. And that sentence did not land like an accusation. It landed like a mirror, reflecting back not just her actions but the reasoning behind them. And in that reflection, there was nowhere to hide. The crowd felt it. You could see it in the way people shifted their stance, in the way some lowered their eyes, not out of guilt necessarily, but out of recognition, because moments like this do not just expose one person, they expose a pattern, and patterns are harder to ignore once they are visible. A man near the bar cleared his throat softly, as if to break the tension, but no one followed, because the silence now served a purpose. It held the moment in place. It allowed it to fully form before anything moved forward. I did not raise my voice. Darius continued, his tone steady, measured. I did not argue. I did not demand anything. He glanced briefly around the deck, taking in the faces, the attention, the awareness that had replaced earlier indifference. I stood here and let you decide who I was. And that sentence carried more weight than the reveal itself, because it shifted responsibility. It reframed the entire interaction as a choice, not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a decision made in real time, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to explain away. The hostess looked down briefly, then back up, her expression no longer defensive, no longer confident, just exposed. I did not know, she said quietly, and for the first time. Her voice matched the reality of the moment. But Darius shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in correction. You were not supposed to. No, he said, and the words settled differently, softer, but no less powerful, because they removed the excuse entirely. They made it clear that the test was never about recognition. It was about treatment, about how someone is handled when there is no title to guide the interaction, no visible status to influence behavior, just presence, just a person, and in that clarity, the entire deck seemed to shift again, not with tension, not with anticipation, but with understanding, the kind that lingers longer than the moment itself, the kind that does not fade when the music comes back on, because it changes something underneath it, something quieter, something more permanent. The words settled into the night like a quiet verdict, not shouted, not forced, but final in a way that did not need repetition. And for a moment, the entire deck held that stillness, not out of confusion anymore, but out of recognition, because what had just been revealed was not just about who Darius Cole was. It was about what everyone else had chosen to see before they knew. And that realization does not fade quickly. It lingers, it presses, it forces people to look inward in ways they did not expect when they stepped onto a yacht, expecting nothing more than music and champagne. The hostess stood there, no longer trying to reclaim authority, no longer issuing commands. Her posture now caught between what she had been and what she understood she could no longer be in this moment. I followed what I thought was right, she said, her voice softer now, not defensive, not sharp, just exposed. And the honesty in it did not erase what had happened, but it changed the tone of the space. Because acknowledgement, even partial, shifts the energy from resistance to reflection, Darius did not respond immediately. He let the words exist, let them breathe, because rushing to answer would reduce the weight of what was unfolding. And this was not a moment to rush. This was a moment to let truth settle fully. What you followed, he said finally, calm and measured, was not policy. It was perception. And that distinction landed clearly, because it separated action from intent. And in doing so, it revealed the deeper layer beneath the interaction. A few guests nodded subtly, not in agreement with him directly, but in recognition of the pattern he was pointing to, because they had seen it before, maybe not on a yacht, maybe not in this setting, but in other spaces, other moments, where assumptions moved faster than facts. The man in the gray suit shifted slightly, his presence still composed, but now more observant than active, because he understood that what was happening was no longer about structure or protocol. It was about accountability, and accountability requires space, not interruption. The staff member who had been ready to escort Darius out stepped further back now, fully removed from the center of the interaction, his role no longer needed, because the situation had moved beyond control and into clarity, and clarity does not require enforcement. It requires acknowledgement. The hostess glanced briefly at the surrounding guests, noticing for the first time how many eyes were on her, not judging, not attacking, but watching. And that kind of attention carries a different kind of weight. It is not loud, but it is undeniable, because it reflects reality back at you in real time. "I did not mean to disrespect you," she said. And this time the words were careful, deliberate, chosen with awareness rather than assumption, and Darius nodded slightly, not in acceptance, but in understanding. Because intention and impact are not the same, and recognizing that difference is part of what this moment was revealing. "Disrespect does not always come with intention," he replied, his voice steady. "Sometimes it comes from habit, from what we have been taught to expect." He glanced briefly toward the crowd again, not singling anyone out, but including them in the statement. Because this was no longer just a conversation between two people, it was a reflection shared across everyone present. And what we expect often says more about us than the person standing in front of us. The words moved through the deck like a quiet current, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady. And in that steadiness, people felt it, the shift from watching a situation to understanding it, from witnessing an interaction to recognizing a pattern. A man near the edge of the deck exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding, while a woman beside him lowered her phone completely, no longer recording, because the moment had moved beyond spectacle and into something more personal, something that did not need documentation to be understood. "What happens now?" the hostess asked, and the question carried a different tone than anything she had said before. Not demanding, not challenging, but seeking. And that shift mattered, because it showed that the moment had reached its turning point, the place where reaction ends and responsibility begins. Darius considered her for a moment, not evaluating her as a person, but acknowledging the role she had played in the moment and the opportunity that now followed it. "Now you listen," he said simply. And the simplicity of the answer made it more powerful, because it did not complicate what was needed. It did not create a performance out of accountability. It reduced it to something direct, something actionable. "You listen to what just happened, not just to me, but to yourself," he continued. "And you decide if that is the standard you want to represent moving forward." The words did not accuse, they did not punish, they placed responsibility exactly where it belonged. And in doing so, they gave space for change without forcing it. The man in the gray suit nodded once, subtle but clear, as if confirming that the moment had reached its intended purpose. Not a confrontation, not a spectacle, but a revelation. The kind that does not end when the conversation ends. The kind that stays with people long after the night is over. The hostess lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again. And this time there was no performance in her expression, no attempt to regain control, just awareness, real and unfiltered. "I understand," she said quietly, and the words, though simple, carried weight. Because they were not spoken to resolve the moment, they were spoken to acknowledge it, and that distinction mattered, because acknowledgement is the first step toward change. The music did not resume immediately. No one rushed to reset the atmosphere, because the atmosphere had already changed, and everyone felt it. The deck no longer held the same energy it had at the beginning of the night. It held something deeper, something more grounded. A reminder that moments like this do not need volume to be powerful. They need truth, and truth, when spoken calmly and clearly, has a way of reshaping everything around it without ever raising its voice. The air did not rush back in after her words. It stayed still, as if the night itself wanted to make sure nothing diluted what had just settled into place. And that stillness carried a different kind of weight now. Not tension, not anticipation, but awareness. The kind that lingers quietly and refuses to be ignored. Darius Cole stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, not elevated, not positioned differently. Yet everything around him had shifted, not because he moved, but because the truth had, and truth has a way of rearranging space without ever touching it. The hostess remained in front of him, her posture no longer rigid, no longer performing control, but grounded in something she had not expected to face that night. Herself, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because the silence itself had become part of the conversation, a space where reflection was louder than words. A guest near the far railing finally exhaled audibly, the sound subtle but noticeable, like a release of pressure that had built without anyone realizing it. Another guest adjusted his jacket, not out of discomfort with the temperature, but with the shift in atmosphere, because what had started as entertainment had turned into something far more personal, something that quietly asked everyone present to consider where they stood in moments like this. Resume the music. The man in the gray suit said softly to the DJ, not as a command, but as a signal that the structure of the event could begin to return. But even as the first notes drifted back across the deck, lighter now, more cautious, they did not erase what had happened. They moved around it, like water flowing around a stone that had already settled into place. The hostess turned slightly, glancing toward the staff member who had been waiting earlier, then back to Darius, as if recalibrating her role in real time. "Is there anything you would like adjusted?" she asked, and the question carried a different tone now, not procedural, not forced, but intentional, because it was no longer about maintaining an image. It was about responding with awareness. Darius considered her question for a moment, not because he needed something changed, but because he understood what the question represented: an opportunity, not for him, but for her, and for the space she represented. "Yes," he said calmly, and the word alone drew subtle attention again. Not tension, but focus, because people understood that whatever followed would not be random, it would be deliberate. "I would like you to treat the next person who walks onto this deck the same way you would treat someone you believe belongs here," he said, his voice steady, measured, and the simplicity of the request made it more powerful, because it did not demand correction for the past. It set a standard for the future, and that distinction mattered. The hostess nodded slowly, absorbing the instruction, not as a task, but as a principle, and that difference showed in the way she held herself now. More grounded, less performative, more aware of the weight behind each interaction. The man in the gray suit stepped slightly closer again, his presence now aligned with Darius rather than positioned between him and the situation. "We can also review the intake process at the dock," he added, his tone professional but reflective. "Ensure that identification does not rely solely on visible cues." Darius nodded once, acknowledging the point, because systems, like people, reflect the assumptions they are built on, and adjusting those systems requires more than surface changes. It requires understanding what they are reinforcing. A few guests nearby exchanged glances again, but this time there was something different in their expressions, not curiosity, not confusion, but respect, not just for Darius, but for the way the moment had been handled, without escalation, without spectacle, just clarity, and that clarity had done more than any raised voice could have. It had shifted the tone of the entire space. A woman who had been recording earlier lowered her phone completely now, not because the moment was over, but because it had moved beyond something that needed to be captured. It had become something to be understood. The staff member who had hesitated before stepped forward again, but this time not to remove anyone, simply to adjust a nearby table, his movements quiet, respectful, almost symbolic in the way they reflected the reset happening across the deck. The hostess took a small breath, steadying herself, then spoke again. "Thank you," she said, and the words were not formal, not rehearsed. They were real, because they acknowledged not just the correction, but the opportunity to see differently, and that kind of acknowledgement carries its own weight. Darius gave a slight nod, not dismissive, not overly affirming, just enough to recognize the shift, because he understood. That change does not happen in a single moment. It begins in one, and whether it continues depends on what follows. The music continued softly now, blending back into the background. Conversations began to resume in low tones, but they were different conversations, quieter, more thoughtful, because everyone present had just witnessed something that did not fit into the usual rhythm of an event like this, and that disruption, though subtle, had left its mark. A man near the bar leaned toward his friend again, but this time his voice carried a different tone. "I almost said something earlier," he admitted quietly, and his friend nodded. "Yeah," he replied. "Me too." And those small exchanges, barely audible, were part of the larger shift, because awareness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up in what people choose to say next, or what they regret not saying before. Darius glanced briefly out toward the water, the city lights reflecting across the surface in long, steady lines, and for a moment, The scene returned to what it had been at the start, calm, composed, elegant, but now it held something else beneath it, something quieter, something more grounded, a reminder that dignity does not need to be declared loudly to be recognized. It only needs to be held consistently, and when it is, it changes everything around it without ever raising its voice. The music had returned, but it no longer controlled the room. It followed it, softer, more careful, like even the rhythm understood that something deeper had taken place. And while conversations slowly picked back up across the deck, they carried a different tone now, quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone was choosing their words with more awareness than before. Darius Cole remained near the railing, not removed from the event, not elevated above it, just present, the same way he had been from the beginning. But now that presence was understood differently, not questioned, not dismissed, simply recognized, and recognition, once established, changes how everything moves around it. A man in a charcoal suit approached him carefully, not hesitant, but respectful. "Mr. Cole," he said, extending his hand slightly. "I did not realize you were here tonight." And Darius accepted the gesture with a calm nod, not making the moment larger than it needed to be. "That was intentional," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried the same quiet authority that had defined every word he had spoken so far. The man gave a small, understanding smile, stepping back without trying to extend the interaction, because he understood that this was not a moment for networking or introductions. It was something else entirely, something that had already set its tone across the deck. The hostess moved with a different rhythm now, her posture still professional, still composed, but no longer driven by assumption. She greeted a couple stepping onto the upper level with a measured warmth, her tone even, her words thoughtful, and though the interaction was simple, it carried a noticeable shift, because those who had witnessed what happened earlier could see the difference, subtle but real, and that difference mattered more than any apology could have. The man in the gray suit stood near the center of the deck, speaking quietly into his phone, coordinating adjustments, not reacting to a crisis, but refining a system, because what had been revealed was not something to correct in the moment alone. It required structure, follow-through, intention, and his movements reflected that understanding, efficient, precise, grounded. A woman who had been near the bar earlier stepped closer to Darius, her expression thoughtful, not intrusive. "Can I ask you something?" she said carefully, and he turned slightly toward her, giving her his attention without hesitation. "You already knew how that was going to go, did not you?" she asked, and there was no accusation in her tone, just curiosity, the kind that comes from witnessing something that challenges what you thought you understood. Darius paused for a moment, not avoiding the question, just considering it fully before answering. "I knew it was possible," he said, and that answer landed differently than a simple yes or no, because it acknowledged something broader, something that extended beyond this one moment, beyond this one deck. "And you still walked into it?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost reflective, and he nodded slightly. "Because if you do not see it, you cannot change it," he replied, and the clarity of that statement settled into the space between them, not heavy, not overwhelming, just true. The woman exhaled slowly, nodding as if something had clicked into place, then stepped back, not needing to say more, because some answers do not require follow-up. They require reflection. Nearby, two guests who had remained silent earlier now spoke quietly to each other. "I thought she was right at first," one admitted, his voice low, almost reluctant, and the other nodded. "Me too," he said. "That is the part that bothers me." And that exchange, simple as it was, carried weight, because it revealed something deeper than the surface interaction. It showed how quickly assumptions can feel justified when they align with expectation, and how unsettling it is to realize that alignment does not equal accuracy. The hostess approached Darius again, not with urgency, not with authority, but with intention, her steps measured, her posture grounded. "I have already spoken with the dock team," she said, her tone steady. "We are adjusting how we verify guests moving forward." And Darius nodded once, acknowledging the action, because change, even small, matters more than words alone. "Good," he said simply, and the brevity of his response did not diminish it, it reinforced it. Because approval does not need to be elaborate to be clear, she hesitated for a brief moment, then added, I also wanted to say, I understand what you meant earlier. And this time, the words were not about apology, they were about comprehension, and that distinction mattered, because understanding is what carries forward beyond the moment. Darius looked at her, not evaluating, not judging, just recognizing the shift, and gave a slight nod, because sometimes acknowledgement is enough. The music lifted slightly, the rhythm finding its place again. But it no longer defined the night. It complemented it, the conversations that followed were different, more grounded, less performative, because everyone present had been reminded of something simple but often overlooked, that presence does not come from appearance, and belonging is not determined by expectation. A guest near the far end of the deck raised his glass slightly, not in celebration, not loudly, just a quiet gesture of recognition, and though no announcement followed, no speech, no spotlight, the meaning carried across the space, because it did not need amplification. It had already been understood. Darius remained where he was for a moment longer, looking out over the water, the city lights stretching across the horizon in steady lines, unchanged, constant, and in that stillness, there was something grounding, a reminder that moments like this, though powerful, are not isolated. They are part of a larger pattern, one that can be challenged, shifted, redefined, not through noise, but through clarity, consistency, and the refusal to move when the world expects you to step aside. And as the night continued, the yacht carried forward, not just through the water, but through something else entirely, a subtle but undeniable shift in how the space it held was understood. The night continued, but it no longer moved the same way it had before. There was a subtle shift beneath everything, not loud, not disruptive, but steady, like a current running under calm water, and every person on that yacht felt it whether they acknowledged it or not. Conversations resumed, laughter returned in small bursts, glasses clinked again, but the ease that had defined the earlier hours was replaced by something more grounded, something more aware. Darius Cole stepped away from the railing slowly, not to claim space, not to draw attention, but simply to move through it. And as he did, people adjusted, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough to show that the perception of him had changed, not based on what he wore, not based on assumption, but based on understanding. A man who had earlier whispered doubts now straightened slightly as Darius passed, offering a small nod, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And Darius returned it with the same calm acknowledgement he had carried all night. No more, no less, because respect, when real, does not need to be exaggerated. Near the center of the deck, the hostess continued her role, but there was a noticeable difference now in the way she engaged with each guest. She paused longer before speaking, listened more carefully, her tone measured not by habit, but by awareness, and those who interacted with her felt it, even if they could not immediately name it, because authenticity carries a different weight than performance, and it lingers longer in the spaces between words. The man in the gray suit approached Darius once more, this time without urgency, his steps aligned with the rhythm of the now steadier atmosphere. We have begun documenting the adjustments, he said quietly. This will extend beyond tonight. And Darius nodded, his gaze steady. It should, he replied, because moments like this are not meant to end where they begin. They are meant to extend, to inform, to reshape what comes next. A server passed by with a tray of drinks, offering one to Darius with a polite smile, not forced, not overly eager, just respectful, and Darius accepted it with a simple thank you. The exchange brief, but meaningful in its normalcy, because that was the point, not to be treated differently because of status, but to be treated consistently regardless of perception. Across the deck, a group of guests who had been observing earlier now spoke openly. I keep thinking about what he said, one woman admitted, her voice thoughtful, about how we decide who someone is before they say anything. Another nodded. We do that all the time, he said quietly, and the honesty in that admission carried its own weight. Because awareness begins where denial ends. The music lifted slightly, not overpowering, but enough to re-establish the flow of the evening. And yet, even in that, the tone remained different, less about display, more about presence. The hostess moved toward the entrance of the upper deck as a new guest stepped aboard, her posture composed, her expression calm, and for a brief moment, those who had witnessed the earlier interaction watched closely, not out of skepticism, but out of curiosity, and this time, her greeting was simple, direct, and open. "Welcome," she said, her voice even. "Let me know if you need anything." No assumptions, no evaluation, just acknowledgement. And though the moment passed quickly, it carried significance, because it showed change not in words, but in action. Darius observed it from a distance, not intervening, not directing, just noting, because real change does not require constant oversight. It reveals itself in behavior when no one is being watched. A man approached him again, older this time, his demeanor calm, his voice steady. "I have been to a lot of events like this," he said, "but I have never seen something handled the way you handled that." Darius listened, not interrupting, and the man continued. "Most people would have made it louder," he said. "Bigger," and Darius gave a slight nod. "That would not have changed anything," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried weight, because it pointed to something deeper. That noise does not equal impact, and control does not require volume. The man smiled, faintly, understanding settling in, then stepped back, leaving the moment where it was, because not every exchange needs to continue once its meaning is clear. The yacht moved steadily across the water, the city lights reflecting in long, uninterrupted lines, and as the night carried on, it became clear that what had happened earlier was not fading. It was integrating, becoming part of the space itself, influencing how people spoke, how they observed, how they interpreted the moments unfolding around them. The hostess paused briefly near the center of the deck, taking in the scene, the guests, the movement, the atmosphere that had shifted under her feet, and for a second, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in recognition, because what she had experienced was not just correction, it was clarity, and clarity, once seen, does not disappear, it stays, shaping every decision that follows. Darius remained present, not dominating the space, not withdrawing from it, simply existing within it, and that presence, steady and unshaken, had done more than any announcement could have. It had redefined the tone of the entire night, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable weight of truth. And as the yacht continued its path across the dark water, the night no longer felt like just another exclusive event. It felt like something else entirely, something more intentional, more aware, a reminder that dignity does not need permission to exist, and when it is held firmly, without apology, it changes everything around it without ever asking for attention. The night did not reset, it evolved, and that evolution could be felt in the smallest details, in the way conversations carried a little more intention, in the way glances lingered a second longer before assumptions formed, in the way people chose their words more carefully, as if something invisible had shifted the standard of the space itself. Darius Cole walked slowly toward the center of the deck, not to take control, not to command attention, but simply because the night was still, unfolding, and he was part of it. And yet wherever he moved, the energy adjusted, not dramatically, not noticeably to an outsider, but enough for those who had witnessed the earlier moment to recognize that presence was no longer being questioned. It was being acknowledged. The man in the gray suit remained close, but not intrusive, speaking quietly into his phone, coordinating follow-ups that extended beyond the yacht. Because what had been revealed here was not isolated to this one event. It was part of a larger structure that required adjustment, not just in behavior, but in design. "We will implement the update across all entry points," he said softly, then paused, listening. "Yes," effective immediately. His tone calm, efficient, but beneath it was something else, awareness, the kind that comes from seeing a flaw not as a mistake, but as a pattern that had gone unchallenged for too long. Nearby, a group of guests had formed a quiet circle of conversation, not loud, not performative, but thoughtful. "I keep replaying that moment," one woman said, her voice low. "The part where she said he did not belong." Another nodded slowly. "It sounded so normal at first," he admitted. "That is what is bothering me." And that reflection carried weight, because it revealed something deeper than the interaction itself. It showed how easily exclusion can be disguised as routine, how quickly it can be accepted when it fits the expectations people have been taught not to question. Darius paused near them briefly, not interrupting, not inserting himself, but present enough to hear, and he did not correct them, did not guide the conversation, because understanding that comes from within holds more weight than anything imposed from the outside. Across the deck, the hostess continued, moving through her responsibilities. But now there was consistency in her actions, not just a moment of awareness, but a continuation of it. She greeted a man in a simple blazer the same way she greeted a woman in a designer gown, her tone steady, her attention equal, and though it seemed small, it carried meaning, because consistency is what transforms awareness into change. A server approached Darius again, offering another drink, his posture respectful, his tone even. "Would you like something else, sir?" And Darius declined with a slight smile. "I am good, thank you." The exchange simple, unremarkable on the surface, but meaningful in its normalcy, because it reflected what the entire night had been. Moving toward, not special treatment, not correction through exaggeration, but balance, the kind that should have been there from the start. The music shifted slightly, a slower rhythm now, something smoother, less sharp, and it seemed to match the tone of the deck, because everything had settled into a different frequency, one that did not rely on spectacle to hold attention. A man who had remained quiet for most of the evening finally stepped closer to Darius, his expression thoughtful. "Can I say something?" he asked, and Darius nodded slightly, giving him space to speak. "I think a lot of us would have walked away," the man said, choosing his words carefully. "Not because we were wrong, but because it would have been easier." He paused, then added, "You did not." And that observation carried respect, not admiration for power, but recognition of restraint, of the decision to stay present instead of reacting or retreating. Darius considered his words for a moment, then responded calmly, "Walking away does not fix what stays behind," he said, and the sentence settled into the space between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just clear. The man nodded slowly, absorbing it, then stepped back, because some statements do not require response, they require reflection. The yacht continued its steady movement across the water, the skyline shifting slightly as the angle changed, the lights stretching and reforming in long, steady patterns, and in that movement, there was a sense of continuity, a reminder that while moments like this feel significant, they are part of something larger, something ongoing, something that does not end when the night does. The hostess approached the man in the gray suit briefly, speaking in a low voice, and he listened, nodding once, then responding with quiet direction. And though their conversation was not audible, the intent was visible: alignment, adjustment, forward motion, the kind that does not draw attention but creates impact over time. A woman who had been silent most of the evening finally spoke to her companion, her voice soft but firm. "I think the hardest part is realizing how automatic it is," she said, and her companion nodded. "Yeah," he replied, "and how rarely it gets challenged." And that was the core of it, not just the moment itself, but the fact that moments like it often pass without interruption, without awareness, without consequence. And tonight, that pattern had been interrupted, not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly, and that clarity had done more than any confrontation could have. It had revealed something that could no longer be unseen. Darius stepped back toward the railing once more, the same place he had been at the beginning of the night, the same position, the same view. But everything else had changed, not the water, not the skyline, not the yacht itself, but the understanding of the space within it. And that difference, though invisible, was undeniable, because it lived in the way people now moved through that space, the way they spoke, the way they looked, the way they paused before deciding what something meant. And in that pause, there was something new, something more deliberate, something more aware. And that was where real change begins, not in the loud moments, not in the obvious ones, but in the quiet shift between assumption and understanding, where one is replaced by the other without ever needing to raise its voice. The rhythm of the night had fully returned on the surface, music flowing smoothly, glasses refilled, conversations weaving back into place. But beneath it all, something permanent had settled, something that could not be undone by sound or distraction. And that difference revealed itself in subtle ways, in pauses that did not exist before, in the way people now looked twice before forming an opinion, in the way silence carried meaning instead of discomfort. Darius Cole stood once again at the edge of the deck, the same position where everything had started, but now it felt different, not because he had changed, but because the space around him had. And that shift was not loud. It did not demand recognition. It simply existed, steady and undeniable, a reflection of truth settling into place. The man in the gray suit approached him quietly, his tone measured. "We have already begun reviewing staff training protocols," he said. "This will not remain a one-time correction." And Darius nodded slightly, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging what should have always been standard. "Good," he said, his voice calm, because this was never about one moment. And that sentence carried weight, because it expanded the scope beyond the yacht, beyond the event, into something larger, something systemic, something that required more than reaction. It required intention. Nearby, a small group of guests had shifted their conversation. Again, but this time it was not about what had happened. It was about what it meant. It was not just what she said, one man explained, his voice thoughtful. It was how confident she was saying it. Another nodded, like she had done it before. And that realization lingered, because it pointed to something deeper than a single interaction. It revealed repetition, normalization, a pattern that often goes unnoticed until it is challenged. Darius heard fragments of these conversations as he stood there, not inserting himself, not correcting, because the realization belonged to them, and that ownership made it more powerful. Across the deck, the hostess moved with quiet consistency, her actions no longer guided by assumption, but by awareness that now seemed to anchor every decision she made. She greeted a new guest with the same calm respect she offered to those who had been there from the beginning, her tone even, her posture steady, and though no one announced it, no one pointed it out. Those who had witnessed earlier recognized the shift immediately, because change, when real, does not need to be explained. It shows itself. The staff member who had hesitated before now worked with a different confidence, not forced, not defensive, but grounded, as if the uncertainty he felt earlier had been replaced with clarity, and that clarity influenced not just how he acted, but how he carried himself. A woman approached Darius once more, different from the others, older, composed, her expression thoughtful but not hesitant. "You did not correct her right away," she said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Darius turned slightly toward her, listening. "You let it happen," she added, and there was no accusation in her tone, just curiosity, and Darius nodded once. "Because if I stopped it immediately," he said, "you would only see the correction, not the cause." And that distinction settled into the space between them, clear and precise, because it explained something many had felt but had not yet put into words. The woman considered this, then nodded slowly. "So you let the moment reveal itself," she said, and Darius gave a slight nod in return. "Exactly." And that exchange carried more weight than any announcement could have, because it explained not just what had happened, but why it had been allowed to unfold the way it did. Nearby, a man who had been listening stepped closer, his tone reflective. "That is uncomfortable," he admitted, watching it play out like that. And Darius looked at him calmly. "It is supposed to be," he replied. And the honesty in that response did not soften the truth, it clarified it, because discomfort is often where awareness begins. The music shifted again, a slightly more upbeat rhythm now, but it still did not dominate the space. It complemented it, because the tone of the night was no longer defined by sound. It was defined by understanding. The yacht moved steadily across the water, the skyline now slightly farther in the distance, lights blending into the horizon. And in that movement, there was a sense of continuation, not just of the event, but of the impact it carried. The man in the gray suit stepped back after a moment, giving space again, because his role was no longer to manage the moment, but to ensure its implications extended beyond it. A pair of guests near the far side of the deck spoke quietly, their voices low but clear enough to catch fragments. "I think the part that stayed with me," one said, "was how calm he was." The other nodded. "Yeah," he replied, like he did not need to prove anything. And that observation held significance, because it pointed to something deeper than the reveal. It highlighted the power of restraint, of presence that does not seek validation, The hostess paused briefly near the center of the deck again, scanning the space, not as someone enforcing order, but as someone aware of it. And in that awareness, there was something new, something steadier, because control built on assumption had been replaced with something more grounded, something intentional. Darius remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present, and that presence continued to shape the space around him without effort, without force, because it was not about dominance. It was about clarity, and clarity, once established, does not need to repeat itself to remain understood. The night carried on, but it was no longer just another event. It had become something else, something that lingered beneath the surface, influencing every interaction that followed, a reminder that perception, when left unchallenged, defines reality. But when confronted with truth, it has no choice but to change, and that change, though quiet, had already begun. By now, the night had fully absorbed what had happened, not erased it, not moved past it, but integrated it into the atmosphere in a way that quietly shaped everything that followed. And that kind of shift does not announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency, through repetition, through the absence of what once felt normal. Darius Cole remained composed at the edge of the deck, but now he was no longer the center of attention, and that was intentional, because the moment had never been about him standing above the room. It had been about the room seeing itself more clearly. And once that clarity is established, it does not need a spotlight to remain present. A gentle breeze moved across the deck, carrying the sound of the ocean and the softened rhythm of music that now felt like background rather than centerpiece. Guests moved more freely now, but not carelessly. There was a difference in the way they engaged with one another, a subtle awareness that lingered beneath every interaction. A man who had earlier admitted his discomfort now spoke with more certainty. "I keep thinking about how fast we decide things," he said to his companion. "Like we do not even notice we are doing it." And the companion nodded slowly. "We notice now," she replied, and that response carried something important, not just acknowledgement of the moment, but recognition of change, because awareness, once activated, does not simply turn off. Nearby, the hostess continued her work, but what stood out now was not the fact that she had changed. It was how naturally that change was beginning to flow. Her movements no longer carried hesitation. They carried intention, her tone consistent, her attention balanced. And those who interacted with her responded in kind, not because they were instructed to, but because consistency invites consistency. The man in the gray suit approached her briefly, speaking in a low, steady voice. And though their words were not fully audible, the tone was clear: alignment, follow through, accountability. And she nodded, not defensively, not reluctantly, but with understanding, because what had happened earlier was no longer something to recover from. It was something to build from. Darius glanced across the deck, taking in the flow of the evening, the movement of people, the rhythm of conversation, and for a moment, everything appeared as it should have from the beginning: balanced, composed, unforced. But the difference now was that it had been earned, not assumed. A man approached him once more, younger this time, his posture slightly uncertain but his voice steady. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and Darius turned toward him, giving him his attention without hesitation. "Earlier, when she told you to leave," the man paused, choosing his words carefully, "you did not react the way most people would." And Darius nodded slightly. "Most people react to the moment," he said calmly. "I respond to what the moment reveals." And that distinction landed clearly, because it separated impulse from intention, reaction from awareness. The man considered this, then nodded slowly, as if something had settled into place. "That makes sense," he said quietly, and stepped back, not needing to continue, because the answer had already done what it needed to do. Across the deck, a group of guests who had remained silent earlier now spoke openly, their voices carrying a thoughtful tone. "It is strange," one woman said, "how quickly we adjust once we know who someone is," another replied. "Yeah, but the real question is why we need to know it all." And that question lingered, not because it demanded an immediate answer, but because it challenged something deeper, something structural, something that extended far beyond the boundaries of the yacht. The music shifted again, but this time it felt more natural, more aligned with the flow of the evening. no longer attempting to set the tone, but moving with it, and that alignment reflected the larger shift that had taken place, not forced, not imposed, but integrated. The hostess approached a new group of guests stepping onto the deck, her greeting simple, direct, and consistent, and those who had witnessed the earlier moment watched briefly, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. And when the interaction passed without assumption, without hesitation, there was a quiet sense of confirmation, not spoken, not announced, but felt. Darius remained where he was, not needing to move, not needing to engage, because his presence alone had already fulfilled its purpose. The man in the gray suit returned once more, his tone calm. "We have scheduled a full review across all events moving forward," he said. "This will not be isolated." And Darius nodded, because that was the point, not to correct a moment, but to shift a pattern. A woman near the railing looked out at the water, then turned back to her companion. "I think what stayed with me most," she said, "is that he never raised his voice." And her companion nodded. "He did not need to," he replied, and that observation carried weight, because it highlighted something often overlooked, that power does not require volume, that clarity does not need amplification. The yacht continued its steady course, the skyline now stretching farther into the distance, lights blending into the horizon, and as the night moved forward, it became clear that what had happened earlier was not fading, it was settling, embedding itself into the memory of everyone present, not as a dramatic moment, but as a defining one, the kind that shifts perspective quietly but permanently. Darius looked out across the water once more, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, grounded, and in that stillness, there was something final, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of completion, because the moment had done what it needed to do. It had revealed, it had shifted, it had redefined, and now it no longer needed to announce itself. It simply existed in the way the space moved, in the way people spoke, in the way they chose to see each other. And that, more than anything else, was where real change begins, not in the moment itself, but in everything that follows it. The night had reached a point where nothing needed to be proven anymore. No voices needed to rise. No actions needed to escalate, because what had been revealed earlier had already done its work. It had settled into the structure of the space itself, shaping every interaction that followed with a quiet precision that no announcement could replicate. Darius Cole remained near the edge of the deck, the same place where everything had shifted. But now his presence was no longer a question or even a focal point. It was simply part of the environment, integrated, understood, and that integration mattered more than any recognition ever could, because it meant the moment had moved beyond him and into the people around him. The hostess stood near the entrance again, greeting guests as they stepped onto the deck, but there was no trace of the earlier tension in her movements, no hesitation, no overcorrection, just consistency. And consistency, when rooted in awareness, becomes something powerful, something sustainable. A man approached her wearing a simple navy shirt and no visible markers of status, and she greeted him the same way she greeted everyone else, her tone even, her posture open. "Welcome aboard," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried weight, because they were no longer filtered through assumption, they were grounded in presence. The man smiled, stepping onto the deck without interruption, and the moment passed quietly, but those who noticed understood its significance, because it represented something new, something that had not been there before. Across the deck, conversations had taken on a reflective tone, not heavy, not forced, but thoughtful, as if everyone was still processing what had unfolded. "I think what surprised me the most," a woman said softly to her companion, "was how quickly everything changed once people knew who he was." And her companion nodded. "Yeah," he replied. "But that is exactly the problem." And that realization lingered, not because it demanded resolution, but because it exposed something deeper, something that could not be easily dismissed. The man in the gray suit approached Darius once more, his movement steady, his tone composed. "We have confirmed the initial changes will be implemented across all upcoming events," he said, "and we are scheduling a full internal review of staff protocols." Darius nodded slightly, acknowledging the update, because this was the continuation of what the moment required, not reaction, but structure, not correction, but evolution. Make sure it is not just protocol, he said calmly. Make sure it is perspective. And the distinction landed clearly, because policies can be written, but perspective must be understood, and without that understanding, no system truly changes. The man in the gray suit nodded, his expression thoughtful, then stepped back, because the instruction had been given, and now it needed to be carried forward. A guest who had remained silent for most of the evening now spoke, his voice measured. It is strange, he said to a small group nearby, how something so quiet can change the entire tone of a place. And another guest responded, maybe that is the point, she said. It does not need to be loud to be real. And that exchange captured what many were feeling but had not yet expressed. That power does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with clarity. And once that clarity is seen, it reshapes everything without asking permission. Darius took a slow breath, looking out across the water once more. The city lights stretching farther now as the yacht moved steadily forward. And in that moment, there was a sense of completion, not because the night was ending, but because the purpose of the moment had been fulfilled. It had revealed something, shifted something, and now it was no longer about what had happened, but about what would continue. The hostess approached him again, her steps measured, her expression calm. We have made the adjustments you suggested, she said, her voice steady. And I have spoken with the team. Darius turned slightly toward her, listening, and she continued, it will not happen again. And the words were not defensive, not reactive, they were grounded. And that grounding mattered, because it showed that the moment had moved beyond surface correction into something deeper, something internal. Darius gave a slight nod. It will not happen the same way again, he said, and the distinction was subtle but important, because change is not about guaranteeing perfection. It is about ensuring awareness, and awareness changes outcomes. The hostess paused for a moment, then nodded in understanding, because she recognized the truth in that the goal was not to eliminate mistakes entirely, but to remove the blindness that allows them to repeat unnoticed. Nearby, a group of guests raised their glasses in a quiet gesture, not celebratory, not loud, but acknowledging something that had shifted in the space. And though no one announced it, no one formalized it, the meaning carried across the deck, because it did not need amplification. It had already been understood. The music continued, the night moved forward, but everything felt different, not in a way that disrupted the experience, but in a way that deepened it, made it more intentional, more grounded, more real. And as the yacht carried on through the dark water, the lights of the city stretching endlessly ahead, there was a quiet understanding shared among those who had witnessed the moment, that what had happened was not just a correction. It was a reminder that dignity is not something granted by environment or status. It is something carried, something held, and when it is, it has the power to reshape any space it enters without ever needing to announce itself. The night did not end with a final moment. It did not need a closing statement or a dramatic conclusion, because everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in the quietest way possible, through presence, through restraint, through clarity that did not ask for attention yet commanded it anyway. And as the yacht continued its steady path across the dark water, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead like a horizon that refused to close, there was a sense among those on board that something had shifted in a way that would not simply disappear once they stepped back onto land. Darius Cole stood where he had stood before, near the edge of the deck, not because he needed to, but because it was the same place where everything had begun, and now it carried a different meaning, not tension, not conflict, but completion, the kind that does not need to be announced to be understood. The hostess moved through the space one last time, her presence now fully aligned with the tone that had been established. No hesitation, no overcorrection, just consistency, and consistency, when sustained, becomes something stronger than any apology, something that rebuilds trust not through words, but through action repeated over time. A guest approached her, someone new, someone who had not witnessed what happened earlier, and she greeted him the same way she had greeted the last, her tone steady, her attention even, and the moment passed without friction, without assumption, without question, and though it seemed ordinary, it carried the weight of everything that had changed, because ordinary, when done right, is what equality looks like across the deck. Conversations softened as the night moved closer to its natural end, not abruptly, not with a signal, but with a gradual slowing, the kind that happens when people begin to reflect more than they react. A man who had spoken earlier now stood quietly beside the railing, looking out at the water, his expression thoughtful. "I think I will notice things differently after tonight," he said to no one in particular. And though no one responded immediately, a woman nearby gave a small nod, because she felt the same, and that silent agreement carried more weight than any spoken response. The man in the gray suit approached Darius one final time, his tone calm, grounded. "Everything is in motion," he said, "not just here." And Darius nodded, because that was always the intention, not to fix a moment, but to influence what came after it. "Make sure it stays that way," he replied, and the words were not a command. They were a standard, one that did not need to be enforced loudly to be understood clearly. The man nodded in return, then stepped away, his role shifting from presence to continuation, because the work now extended beyond what could be seen. A woman who had been recording earlier scrolled through her phone, then paused, looking at the screen before locking it, not posting, not sharing, just holding the moment for herself, because she understood that not everything needs to be broadcast to have impact. Some things are meant to be carried, internalized, allowed to reshape perspective in ways that do not require an audience. Darius remained still for a moment longer, looking out across the water, the reflections of the city stretching and breaking with the movement of the waves, constant yet shifting. And in that image, there was something familiar, something reflective of what had just taken place. That clarity, like light on water, does not stay fixed, but it continues to move, to influence, to reveal. Long after the moment that first brought it into view, the hostess approached him once more, her steps measured, her presence steady. "Thank you," she said. And this time the words carried no hesitation, no uncertainty, just understanding. And Darius looked at her briefly, not evaluating, not responding with more than what was needed. "Keep it consistent," he said, and the simplicity of the instruction made it more powerful. Because consistency is what turns awareness into change. She nodded, not as someone receiving correction, but as someone accepting responsibility, and that distinction marked the true end of what had begun earlier, not resolution, but transformation. Guests began to move toward the exit slowly, not rushing, not eager to leave, but aware that the night had given them something more than what they had expected when they arrived, something that would follow them beyond the deck, beyond the water, into the spaces they occupied every day. Conversations were quieter now, more reflective, less performative, because the experience had shifted something internal, something that would not easily return to its previous state. Darius finally stepped away from the railing, moving toward the exit without announcement, without drawing attention, because he did not need to. His presence had already done what it needed to do, and as he passed through the space, people did not stop him, did not question him, did not even make a moment out of it. They simply acknowledged him, some with a nod, some with a glance, some with nothing more than the absence of assumption. And that, more than anything else, was the true measure of what had changed. The yacht continued forward, the night settling into its final rhythm. But what remained was not the music, not the lights, not the event itself. It was the understanding that had been created, the quiet realization that dignity is not something that can be granted or denied by environment. It is something that exists regardless, and when it is met with clarity instead of assumption, it does not need to demand respect. It naturally receives it. And as the last guest stepped off the deck and the space slowly emptied, the shift that had taken place remained, not visible, not loud, but embedded, a silent standard now present in every interaction that would follow. A reminder that true power does not announce itself, it reveals itself, and once revealed, it changes everything.